Hi, my name is Herman Kraft. I'm with the Department of Political Science and I was asked to talk to you about Philippine national security. Now, when we talk about security, these are the kinds of images we actually think about or at least imagine when we try to talk about the idea of national security, right? It's either some country that's actually threatening the Philippines, no, or destruction that's caused by conflict, armed conflict, or even the notion of a terrorist attack, for instance. In other words, it's a threat of violence that we normally think about when security is the matter that we usually try to imagine. The point I'm going to make is that security is actually much more complex than that, right? And in fact, within the context of the Philippines, security goes beyond the idea of the threat of violence, no? Perpetrated by either an external foe or something that's actually happening inside the Philippines. Okay? In the Philippine Constitution, in Article 2, which is about the Declaration of Principles and State Policies, for instance, you can see indications of what exactly it is that seems to hint at what we mean or what we talk about when we are referring to security, right? Section 3, for instance, talks about the idea of securing the sovereignty of the state and the integrity of national territory. Section 4 of the same article tells us about the idea of the need to serve and protect the people, right? And in Section 5, we have the idea of maintaining law and order, the protection of life, liberty, and property, and the promotion of general welfare, essential to the enjoyment of all the people within the context of the blessings of democracy. So if you look at all of those things, right, and we think of it in terms of securing something, what you can actually see is that security, as far as the Philippines is actually concerned, crosses a lot of boundaries, and it's not limited to the notion of a physical threat either to the country, even though we talk about the idea of the integrity of the national territory, nor are we just talking about the physical survival of, say, Filipinos, right? What you can see when you start talking about the things that have to do with general welfare, for instance, within the context of democracy, seems to indicate values, right? That we believe in democracy, that we need to protect democracy, and within the context of democracy, we need to actually protect people, right? What they stand for, what it is that they believe in, and their general welfare as essential elements to what we talk about as security. Regardless, though, and this is actually where we start talking about a number of things. What you have in terms of the Constitution, what it contains and talks about as things that we need to value and therefore need to secure, need to be translated into what we refer to as policy. That is to say, what is exactly it is that we expect government to do when we talk about securing these things. Ever since the Aquino administration, the government in power has actually come out with what it refers to as the national security policy, right? And within the context of the national security policy, the priorities, if you will, of the administration as far as national security is concerned, is outlined. The first time we did this was under the Aquino administration, right? And under the Aquino administration, okay, the emphasis was on securing the gains of democracy. So the emphasis was on the idea of making sure that democracy would actually prosper, right? So within that context, we see that the national security policy was about good governance, the delivery of basic services, economic reconstruction, and sustainable development, right? As well as the idea of security sector reform, right? Within this context, there are essential elements that have to do with what are the assumptions behind these priorities, if you will. Number one was, of course, the changing security environment. That is to say that there was a sense that the security environment outside of the Philippines, at that time, was actually stable, right? At the beginning of, or when the NSP under the Aquino administration was actually released, there was just this sense that the external environment that the Philippines was part of was something that was stable, that was continuing. There was some sort of consistency, as far as the conditions that existed. Now, of course, there were a number of issues that had to be faced, and this had to do with questions that that also illustrated the continuing threat of violence. But much of this had to do with internal conditions, like the emphasis on terrorism, for instance. But one of the things that the Aquino administration emphasized was the importance of looking at what we refer to as non-traditional security concerns, that included climate change, public health, and of course energy security. So in other words, you can see here that national security was seen beyond the idea that security was simply the realm of the security sector, meaning to say the armed forces as well as the Philippine National Police, right? That national security was something that actually involved, and this is a favorite buzzword, starting from the time of the Aquino administration, that we talked about things like, for instance, the whole of government, the whole of society. Now we talk about the whole of nation approach to security, right? But what you can see here is as we expand what exactly it is that we mean in terms of what is important as far as security is concerned, then that means that we're going beyond the idea that security involves threats, right, coming from other countries, or internal actors within the country. We're talking also about, as you can see here, we're talking about things that have to do with the conditions that exist within our society, and of course those that have to do with the future of our society. When we talk about climate change, for instance, and energy security, this really has to do with what future generations face, right? So, in other words, national security was now not only something that was about the conditions that exist now, it also talks about, or it is also about, future conditions that the government has to actually take into consideration. Within the context of the national security policy of the Aquino administration, there were 7 basic elements that were being emphasized: socio-political stability, territorial integrity, economic solidarity and strength, ecological balance, cultural cohesiveness, moral spiritual consensus, and external peace. As you can see, there are a lot of things here that have nothing to do with our traditional notions of what security are. In fact, if you look at it, the only thing that actually seems to have something to do with the traditional notion is number 2, and perhaps to a certain extent number 1 as well, right? When you talk about socio-political stability, then you might be talking about threats coming from within, insurgencies, secessionist movements, and so on. And territorial integrity obviously refers to threats coming from the outside. But everything else is actually something that has to do with, except for external peace, everything else has to do with conditions that exist within Philippine society, and not having to do directly with the issue of armed violence, right? When the Duterte administration came into power, however, right, the emphasis was now on change, and the well-being of the Filipinos, right? And within this context, and I think we're more or less familiar with what President Duterte actually tends to emphasize. If we talk about the idea of security under his watch, the emphasis on change had to do with the end of lawlessness and all armed conflicts. In other words, all of the things that had bedeviled Philippine society for decades, was something that the Duterte administration sought to end, as far as armed conflicts are concerned, and of course, as we all are familiar with, the emphasis on lawlessness, and the need to actually impose order, right? And so within this context, right, the emphasis were on economic prosperity, okay, the need to equip Filipinos with the capacity to actually operate within an increasingly competitive economic environment, and of course the need to actually maintain an independent foreign policy, right? So this is the first time that we begin to actually hear about the idea of an independent foreign policy as a center point, as far as our external relations are actually concerned. The elements that the Duterte administration thought about, as having to do with national security are not all that different from what the Aquino administration actually emphasized. But instead of actually talking about 7 points, now there are 8 elements now, with an increased emphasis on public safety, law and order, and justice. Everything else is pretty much the same, which is illustrative precisely of the importance given to public safety by the Duterte administration, being the only, shall we say, a change in terms of what is being emphasized. But what is interesting about both the national security policies of the Aquino and Duterte administration is the definition of national security that we're actually introduced to. Okay? Both define national security as a state or condition where our most cherished values and beliefs, our democratic way of life, our institutions of governance, and our unity, welfare, and well-being as a nation and people are permanently protected and continuously enhanced. This is a very, very expansive notion of what national security is. We're not just talking about, just like what I said, the images that I showed you at the beginning, threats from external sources, as well as threats from within, all having to do with the potential for armed violence or armed conflict. Here we can see with this definition the expansive notion of what national security is. And when we talk about an expanded or expansive notion of it, this of course raises a few questions. Number one is, of course, what is actually being protected? Who is it that is being secured? Or in other words, within the context of what we refer to as the literature on national security, whose security? Right? The state is seen as the collective expression of the people. So when we talk about, if we go back to the definition, the emphasis there is on the people, right? The need to protect their values, their beliefs, the democratic way of life of the people, right? So which basically means that we need to actually understand what the people means, right? And in here, what's presented is that the state becomes that collective expression of who it is that we're actually protecting. So when we talk about national security, this falls within the very traditional notion that we protect the state or we defend the state, right? In fact, if you look at the Constitution, one of the articles in Section 2 actually talks about the obligation of citizens to actually be called upon to defend the state, right? In fact, that's the very basis of why we have the national security law, for instance, and why we have the NSTP, right? But there's an interesting point here. If the state is the object of security, it is what is supposed to be protected, precisely because it is the collective expression of who the people are. It is also at the same time the provider of security, which creates a possible conflict of interest. In other words, the object of security is the one who defends or defines what might be a threat to security. And when that happens, it becomes a notion of who is it that's expressing the collective position. And usually this is where we talk about the differences between the government, the state, as well as the people. But essentially, what we can see here, the point about national security is that it's about the people themselves, right? That the need to actually protect what exactly it is that people feel are important. The main problem here, of course, is that if you talk about the people, it is a collective now, meaning to say that you're talking about a collectivity of individuals. Does people then mean the accumulation of all individual wants, individual needs, individual senses of what is important and what is urgent, right? So in that sense, somebody has to actually make those choices for them, and that's where government actually comes in. But necessarily a government that has to listen to what it is that the people might actually have to say. Okay? But the point here is this. When you talk about the idea of security in this context, then what comes out would be the need to be able to define what is prioritized, what is urgent. Because essentially that's what security means. To define something as being a security issue means that there is an extraordinary circumstance and requirement that means that it has to be responded to with some urgency, right? So in that kind of context, it requires, and when you talk about urgency, what it means is it requires a certain amount of resources to be allocated to it, right? And so this is where government plays a role. It is the instrument or the institution which is responsible for defining precisely what it is that constitutes what is urgent, that constitutes what is a priority, as far as what we talk about as national security. Because when you talk about security, there are different levels at which we have to actually appreciate things. We begin with the individual. In fact, individuals feel, or at the level of the individual, the sense of insecurity actually can be expressed in different ways. We can talk about what it is that we need. So individual needs translate into the notion of how or whether or not an individual actually feels secure. Then we go up to the level of the family. Beyond the family, of course, is the state, and of course the international arena. But looking at these different levels at which we can express security, you can now understand how important it is to actually define precisely what our priorities are. In other words, what is it that we need to secure, and whose security it is that we need to actually emphasize. So which brings us now to certain issues that we talk about regarding security in the Philippines, right? The Duterte administration has actually defined, in other words, the expansive notion of security tells us that there are different issues that we need to actually look at, think about when we take into consideration what are the security issues the country the country is actually facing at this point in time. The Duterte administration has basically said from the very beginning of its accession to power that the major threat to the country, to the country's security, is actually drug trafficking, right? And if you look at the slide that I actually have here, we talk about statistics about exactly how many drug users are there in the Philippines. Now, the point is, it doesn't matter whether the numbers that the president has actually talked about, which is much more than what official statistics actually show, is more correct, than those official statistics. The point here is that you can see that the numbers are actually enormous. In other words, there are significant numbers of drug users, and therefore, a significant to a significant extent, drug trafficking and the drug issue, is a very, very important part of what's ailing society at this point, right? But this is not something that is limited to the Philippines, right? In other words, that's why we talk about drug trafficking. It is about drugs actually entering the Philippines, and being marketed here, or being transshipped from the Philippines to other places in the country. The Philippines is actually an interesting case as far as drug trafficking is concerned, because we are not only a market, we are actually in which case we are a destination for those who export drugs. We are also actually a transshipment point. That is to say that from the Philippines, drugs are actually exported to other parts of the Asia-Pacific region. So in that sense, the Philippines is actually an important part. And the Duterte administration's fight against drugs is an important part of the overall effort to, if not eliminate, to limit the extent to which drug trafficking is a regional issue. Okay? So in other words, drug trafficking is not your traditional notion of what we talk about as security, and yet, to a large extent, it is something that concerns us, and rightly so. The Duterte administration actually feels that it is something that should be prioritized. But it's not just about drugs, right? When you talk about trafficking issues, human trafficking is also one of the issues that we actually have to keep in mind. Statistics actually show that the Asia-Pacific region is one of the regions where human trafficking is a most lucrative undertaking of criminal cartels around the region, right? In fact, according to statistics, human trafficking cartels in the Asia-Pacific region actually earn the most, okay, in terms of the total trade around the world. Okay, they pretty much constitute almost 35% of the entire trade itself. No? And within that context, the Philippines is actually one of the most vulnerable countries, precisely because of the number of overseas Filipino workers that we have deployed outside of the country. The irony is that for all the number of years that we have had this problem amongst us, meaning to say that being one of the most vulnerable countries as far as human trafficking is concerned, we only have a few hundred people who have actually been charged and convicted of human trafficking in the country. Okay, despite the efforts of past administrations, including the Duterte administration, and up to the Duterte administration, it has been a very, very difficult process to not only stop but to actually be able to catch those who have been involved in this particular issue area. Okay? In the case of the Philippines, easily 300,000 to 400,000 victims of human trafficking are women, 60 to 100,000 are children, and 80% of the females that are actually involved or have been victimized in this particular crime are below 18 years old. Right? So you can just imagine the extent to which this constitutes a major problem for Philippine society. Okay? And then of course we don't have to actually we don't have to imagine this particular issue to simply because it is something that we're facing now. In fact, that's the reason why I'm talking to you right now. That I can't talk to you face to face precisely because of the issue of COVID-19, right? But pandemics have always been with us. Perhaps COVID-19 has only been the most serious, in my lifetime. I don't know if there's something more serious that might actually come up in the next decades. I hope not. But so far, this has been the most serious, among a number of cases of pandemics having taken place, right? The point here is that as the COVID-19 has actually shown, the interesting issue is that this is a problem that doesn't just involve the Philippines, right? Just in much the same way that drug trafficking is not just about the Philippines, nor is human trafficking just about the Philippines. The issue of pandemics is something that actually involves multiple countries, multiple societies, and in the case of COVID-19, pretty much all countries around the world are actually affected by it. And the effects are actually multifaceted. We're not just talking about the cases of COVID-19, the stats for which are shown in the slide. We're also talking about the effects of COVID-19, right? Locking down, for instance, closes down or basically shuts down a country's economy, right? People can't make money. People can't earn a livelihood. And when that actually happens, the vulnerabilities to the effects of the pandemic actually multiplies, right? Once somebody actually gets sick and you're not actually in a position to address it, with the necessary economic resources, nor with the necessary health resources, for instance, then you're really facing a situation where the vulnerabilities of not just the entire country, but of individuals within the country, begin to translate into a national security problem, right? So what we can actually see here is that national security, as indicated by the three examples that I've actually shown, might actually affect or might be something that's perpetrated on individuals within society. But precisely because you're talking about not just one individual, but a multiplicity of individuals, coming up to a point where you're talking about a collection of a significant number of individuals, then it becomes a national security problem, right? I remember a quote from Joseph Stalin, where he talked about the idea of one person dying might actually be a tragedy because it is a personal thing, no? But 1 million people dying is just a matter of statistics, no? Well, that's not the case here, right? In other words, when we talk about national security, no, the threat to 1 million people, the potential for 1 million people or more actually dying or being affected by it, not just physically, right, means that this is something that the government has to actually take notice of, no, and allocate resources to responding to, right? So the point here is that we're now talking about national security in a much more expanded form. And because it's expanded, we're now talking about multiple issues, no, that need to be taken into consideration. Having said that, we can also think about issues that we have to live with, right? Natural disasters, for instance, right? The Philippines is a country where typhoons generally pass by, stay on, no, take a vacation in, no, every year, no. In fact, it's a joke among us, no, but it's a joke that's actually serious, no, that we run the alphabet, no, every year with the number of typhoons that pass by and the amount of damage and the number of people killed, no, by each incident, no, takes a toll on the resources of individual people, no, local governments, and the national government, right? But we have to live with this, no? Here in this slide, you actually see a map of the West Valley Fault system, no, in Metro Manila, right? Meaning to say that we are living with the fault that we think might be the cause of what we refer to as the big one, no? Meaning to say an earthquake so large, no, that the amount of damage is something that is very difficult for us to actually imagine, no? So much so that it has become part of, no, maybe the observation of the requirement is more in the breach than otherwise, no. But one of the things that we've noticed, no, in the last few years, no, is the emphasis on the need to drill, right? No, in response to disaster preparedness, no, precisely because we are understanding or beginning to understand that these issues, no, are not something that we just leave to chance, right? And these are things that we need to actually prepare for, and to a large extent, no, it becomes part of our national security preparedness. And so efforts are now being actually put into this. This goes back to the point that I'm making, that when we talk about national security, it really involves the idea that you're talking about resources that need to be allocated, no, in order to actually address these issues. Finally, no, we go to what we might consider to be the more traditional way but by which we look at national security. That is to say, to look at it in terms of the potential for conflict with other states, right? And in our case, no, this only means one thing, and that has to do with, of course, the Spratlys, right? So the South China Sea issue, or the West Philippine issue for many of us, no, really involves questions of, as the Constitution refers to, no, questions of sovereignty and the need to actually protect the integrity of our national territory, right? In this case, no, we can see in this slide, no, that there are several countries, together with the Philippines, no, who claim, no, parts of the South China Sea as if not sovereign territory, no, territory that they have sovereign rights over, right? So in the case of the Philippines, when we talk about the West Philippine Sea, for instance, no, a large part of that is clear to us, no, has nothing to do with sovereignty, but we do have sovereign or claims to sovereign rights over them, right? So in this case, no, the issue of overlapping claims, no, is something that needs to be addressed, no, in terms of being able to discuss things, negotiate, no, with our neighbors, no, or with countries in the region. The main problem is that one of the claimants, no, is a major superpower, if you will, no, and has elected to actually throw its weight around. So the problem here, no, is the extent to which this now encroaches and impinges on precisely those values that we have as far as the question of, no, securing sovereignty, as well as making sure that we're able to defend, no, our national territory. There are related issues that have to do with the South China Sea, one of which is, of course, the question of illegal fishing, right? And the extent to which this has been responsible for reducing fish stocks, no, within the region. The Philippines is a country which does not have huge fishing fleets, no, in the same way that Vietnam, Taiwan, China, Japan actually has. Okay, our fishermen are by and large subsistence fishermen, right? Which means that they're not really competing with fishermen from these other countries, no, simply because they're actually trying to catch for a smaller market, so to speak. Okay, and yet precisely because you're talking about huge fishing fleets actually involved in these activities, no, which we refer to as illegal, unreported, or unregulated, no, fishing, then it has a direct effect on the fishing communities in the Philippines. And to a large extent, no, at some point, no, this will actually lead to higher costs as far as the stocks, no, and supply of fish, no, for our own consumption is actually concerned. You can see in this particular map, for instance, no, just how overfished, no, coastal areas are around mainland Southeast Asia, right? So the lighter colored areas, no, indicates, no, heavy fishing activities, no, and therefore these are areas where you can expect, no, fish stocks have actually gone down. That essentially means that those fishing fleets that are, or those fishermen that are actually involved in fishing in these areas will now be moving farther and farther, you know, into the South China Sea and perhaps beyond. Chinese fishing fleets are already in the South Pacific, for instance, you know, together with Japanese fishing fleets, you know, as well as Taiwanese ones. In other words, the idea of reduced fish stocks or overfished fish stocks in the South China Sea is not only something that we're facing, it is a reality that's already on the ground, or on the waters, if you will. What are the things that I'm trying to tell you as far as national security is concerned? We have an imagination as to what national security means, no? And to a large extent, national security tends to be imagined as something that involves only the armed forces of the Philippines, the Philippine National Police, no? Or all those agencies that actually involve the use of arms, no, in order to actually protect Philippine society. No? But what I'm actually telling you right now is that, number one, no, the object of security has now moved from just being about the state, not to one which talks about the need to protect the people. But protecting the people, and protecting the people not just as a collective, and therefore we go back to the state as the object of security, but people in terms of their respective needs, no, and the context within which they're supposed to actually live their lives. And so within that context, it becomes important for us to think about, no, security as being connected to the context of democracy as part of the issues that are urgent for us. Second, no, is that we talk about security in a broader context. Like I said, it's no longer just about armed conflict, no, or the threat of the use of violence. No. As you can see, I emphasized non-violence based issues. No. But nonetheless, issues that actually create, number one, insecurity in people, in communities, and second, no, issues that have expansive effects, no, and third, issues that actually require resources from the government to actually be deployed, no, in order to actually address them. So these are issues that not only, as I've said before, involves the Department of Defense, the Department of Foreign Affairs, no, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, and the police. It now requires, no, a more expansive response, no, that involves, I think it's too much of a cliche, but it's a reality that we have to face, no. As this pandemic actually shows to us, no, we are all involved in trying to actually secure our country and our people. No. Thank you very much. No. I'm just hoping that this actually gives some clarity to the notion of national security.